Trip to Cheorwon DMZ. A short story. By Suksa Park. As we advanced in the darkness, shells went off on the nearby hillside. An instinctive impulse forced me to glance backward. Amidst the intermittent flashes of light, I spotted Private Choi aiming in my direction. He was supposed to follow me for the counterattack. However, the soldier with relentless gaze wasted no time in squeezing the trigger, and before I knew it, I was sprawled on the ground, letting out a scream. My wife roused me from my slumber gently. "Darling, are you having nightmares again? Just look at the perspiration." She tenderly dabbed my face with a towel. I contemplated whether the unsettling dream had been triggered by the news I received the previous day, concerning Sergeant Lee. He and I had fought side by side during the Korean War. I confided in my wife, Sergeant Lee passed away. I received a funeral notice from his son yesterday. She said quietly, "That leech is dead now. Don't speak of him in that manner. Remember, he and I shared an unbreakable bond. A hanger-on, if you ask me. He was 3 years older than you, right?" "Yes," I confirmed. At the first ray of dawn breaking, she rose. It appeared that she couldn't shake off the lingering concern about my nightmares. While she was in the shower, I prepared her breakfast, starting with freshly squeezed orange juice. As a cardiologist, my wife worked long hours at the clinic, leaving for work early in the morning and returning around 8 p.m. I, on the other hand, typically stayed at home. I had once been employed by the municipal government of Daegu, one of South Korea's largest cities, but that was 30 years ago. I had been let go and hadn't held a job since. In my pajamas, I served my wife a glass of freshly squeezed juice and hot scrambled eggs. "Eat well, dear. You have a long day ahead of you." She briefly scanned the front page of the day's newspaper before heading to work. As the head of a clinic, staying informed about city and global events was crucial. She skimmed through the front page of the day's newspaper before heading to work. As the head of a clinic, it was essential for her to stay informed about events in the city and beyond. Her free time was limited. Her forest green knit pantsuit complemented her milky white complexion and hung elegantly on her slim figure. In her youth, she bore a resemblance to Audrey Hepburn. Time had added a little weight, which, in my opinion, only enhanced her beauty. She was 64 years old, 12 years younger than me. Her skin remained clear, her short hair neatly styled. My friends teased me. "How did someone like you land such a beautiful and competent wife?" I felt it was time to bring up a subject I'd been meaning to discuss. "I'd like to take a trip to Cheorwon. It'll be an overnight stay." I thought Sergeant Lee lived on the southern coast, near Busan. "They can proceed with the funeral without me. I'm heading to Cheorwon instead. It's October, that time of year again. I must go there and visit the battleground before my time runs out. Take a look at this picture." His son sent it along with the funeral notice. I believe Sergeant Lee had asked his son to send it before his passing. I showed her a small, yellowing photograph of Sergeant Lee and me, taken just before we were deployed to the Battle of White Horse Hill. I couldn't recall how the picture was taken or how Sergeant Lee had managed to preserve it for all those years. Unlike him, I had disposed of all my wartime mementos. In fact, I had destroyed all remnants of that era. This fading keepsake depicted the two of us, with my lieutenant's insignia beside the sergeant's head. I had been considerably taller than him. My wife, who had been enchanted by my youthful appearance back then, closely examined the photo. Was she reminiscing about our younger days? Her parents had been deeply disheartened by her choice. I was alone, without a single relative, but that was mostly a consequence of the war. I had barely a penny to my name. Her parents' assessment of me was harsh. What good are looks when there is no substance? In her parents' eyes, I wasn't deemed worthy of her. Perhaps they were right. She was the most sought-after young lady in Daegu's high society at the time, a well-bred and attractive medical student. Yet, their objection only seemed to intensify her fascination with me. As the clock approached 7 a.m., my wife had to leave for work, and I needed to prepare for my journey. I told her, I need to withdraw some cash from our account. As she backed the black Hyundai Grandeur out of our driveway, she impatiently retorted, "Since when did you have to seek my permission to access money?" Indeed, we had relied on her income for the past 3 decades. However, it seemed that she had overlooked the fact that I had played a pivotal role in enabling her to focus on her career. Without my unwavering support, she wouldn't have achieved the level of success she enjoys today, nor would she have been able to acquire this charming brick house nestled in the pleasant residential enclave of Daegu. I managed the household and nurtured our 2 children, allowing her the freedom to pursue her professional aspirations. Knowing that our housekeeper was scheduled to arrive that day, I gathered the laundry that needed washing and left her a note, requesting that she also take care of cleaning the windows. As October arrived, our tree was adorned with several vibrant red pomegranates, while the quince fruits ripened to a beautiful shade of yellow. My wife, as usual, returned home late. Even when she was present, she would often occupy herself with work on the computer, leaving the household chores and gardening duties squarely on my shoulders. Considering the upcoming colder weather in Cheorwon, which contrasted with the milder climate of Daegu, a southern city in South Korea, I decided to put on a pair of hiking pants and a jacket that I had purchased from a shop in the subway station. These garments, lined with soft flannel, promised warmth and comfort for my journey. While my wife might prefer to shop at upscale department stores for her clothing, I found the underground garment shops more than satisfactory for my needs. After packing some extra socks and underwear into the knapsack, I left home. At the train station, I bought an 8:30 a.m. ticket to Seoul. Near our bank, close to the station, I obtained some cashier's checks and cash in addition to what I had withdrawn the other day. I descended the escalator. The morning train was crowded, yet it departed punctually. As I nestled into my seat, I gazed out the window, relishing the opportunity to embark on the solo journey I had been meaning to take for quite some time. While looking at the autumn scenery outside the window, I reminisced about my excitement as a teenager, waving the national flag on a street corner. Korea gained its independence after Japan surrendered at the end of World War II. However, just a week after gaining independence, Soviet troops occupied the area north of the 38th parallel. A month later, U.S. soldiers marched into the southern part of the Korean peninsula. The division of the Korean peninsula stemmed from the February 1945 Yalta Agreement between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the USSR. Although President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Premier Stalin presided over the agreement, they likely did not anticipate that the North-South division of Korea would last for such an extended period. The division would eventually catalyze the Korean War, which erupted 5 years later when North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. Kim Il-sung had appealed to Stalin to support his quest to reunify Korea under communist rule. The small country became the battleground for the clash of 2 competing ideologies, capitalism and communism. The train glided through Waegwon, a suburb of Daegu, and then crossed the Nakdong River Bridge, a significant battleground during the Korean War. I leaned back into the velvet seat, closing my eyes. Memories of the events that unfolded in this area during the war flooded my mind. In August 1950, all the bridges along the Nakdong River perimeter had been destroyed to halt the communist advance toward Daegu, which was a mere 10 miles south. According to the intelligence reports, 40,000 communist soldiers were poised for a full-scale assault in the region north of Waegwon. Defending Daegu was paramount for South Korea and the UN forces, no matter the cost. 98 Boeing B-29s departed from Okinawa, Japan, conducting a relentless 26 minutes of carpet bombing in the densely populated area swarming with communist soldiers and their equipment. This devastating aerial onslaught proved catastrophic for the communist forces, leaving the entire region in ruins. Miraculously, Daegu remained successfully defended. The communists had nearly pushed their forces to the southern tip of the Korean peninsula, a development that could have essentially marked the conclusion of the war. The Battle of Waegwan represented the turning point in the war against the North Koreans and the Chinese troops, constituting the first significant victory for South Korean and UN forces. Achieving this victory required the demolition of a bridge that was still congested with refugees and infiltrating communists. With this pivotal turn of events, the tide of the war shifted decisively in favor of the South. In September of 1950, I was a 19-year-old college student hiding in my cousin's attic in communist-occupied Seoul. My father had concealed me there after the communists had visited our home multiple times to recruit me. While hiding in the dim attic, I spent the time listening to the radio. Then, to my horror, I learned from the radio that the district where my family lived was under severe American bombing. When I ran there, our home had been reduced to ashes. I found the charred bodies of my parents and younger brother. While others celebrated the recapture of Seoul, I roamed the streets like a person driven to madness. One day, the South Korean army recruited me through random questioning on a street corner. I was stationed at the front, near the 38th parallel. Winter had descended, and the snow was several feet deep. We battled with frostbitten toes as the front line witnessed repeated advances and retreats. Alone in my mental cocoon, unraveled inside as we fought at the front. After enduring the first several months in such a state, I began to think, I am the only one left in my family. I cannot simply die on a snow-covered mountain. I must find a way to survive. I chose to become an officer and applied for the infantry school, fully aware that platoon leaders often faced greater risks of being killed during battles. However, I reasoned that I would not be on the front lines, at least while I was undergoing training. In the fall of 1952, I was assigned as a platoon leader in the 9th Infantry Division for the Battle of Hilltop 395, named after the hilltop elevated 395 meters above sea level. On the night of October 10, everyone fell asleep after several days of fierce combat. When we heard gunfire, we would shoot while half asleep. Then, when the cannons and gunfire stopped, and everything fell silent, we would suddenly wake up due to the stillness. The Chinese army, which would usually attack during the night, had changed its tactic, hitting us with elite troops in the morning, causing us to lose our dominant hilltop position again. Around 10 p.m. that day, we received a radio message to mobilize and retake the hilltop position. Without hesitation, I shouted, "Advance! Advance!" However, the soldiers hesitated to follow my lead, having witnessed too many comrades fall to enemy fire. Despite the imminent danger, I knew I had to lead my platoon. It was thanks to Sergeants Lee and Kim, who encouraged the soldiers to move forward, that we managed to advance up the slope. I suddenly heard the whizzing sound of a shell passing overhead, followed by a deafening explosion. Intuitively, I glanced back, and illuminated by the flash of light, I spotted a soldier aiming at me. He was so startled by my unexpected turn that he dropped his rifle. Did I misinterpret the situation? Was it just an illusion? However, my gut feeling told me that he had indeed been aiming his gun at me. I had heard stories of soldiers potentially turning their weapons on a platoon leader who ordered an advance despite the peril it posed to the troops. When I had heard such tales before, I had thought them improbable, but now I found myself living one. At that moment, there was nothing I could do, so I mentally noted that the soldier was Private Choi. That night, we finally regained the hilltop position. While we were taking a break, I discreetly beckoned Sergeant Lee over. "This is about Private Choi," I whispered. You mean the guy who took someone else's rifle after losing his own? Yes, that's him. During our advance, I had a feeling someone was targeting me. When I glanced back, I saw his gun aimed at me. I almost got killed while no one was watching. Keep your eye on him. Okay, I'll keep a close watch on him. During the day, Private Choi avoided making direct eye contact with me as I tried to act as if nothing had occurred between us. It appeared that he was aware that I knew about the situation. The next day around 5 p.m., we lost the hilltop position again after brutal close combat involving bayonets. I lost several soldiers, but Private Choi was still alive, his aggressive demeanor still evident. As a platoon leader, it was inconceivable for me to wish harm upon my men, but I still didn't want to encounter that guy again. That night, during a lull in the fighting, I called Sergeant Lee once more. After the rifle theft incident, Sergeant Lee slapped Private Choi in the face and kicked him. In the process, the sergeant had fallen to the ground in front of the other soldiers. I knew that Private Choi had not pushed the sergeant, but rather, the sergeant had fallen due to the sheer weight of the burly private. Nevertheless, the sergeant had not forgotten that incident. Sergeant Lee was known to be unforgiving once someone fell out of his favor. Even before I could say anything, Sergeant Lee whispered, "Lieutenant, that bastard is still alive." "That's why I called you," I replied. "Let's take action before it's too late. You never know when he might try that again." I pointed to a large rock in the distance. "Look at that boulder. Do you see the whitish one?" "Yes, I do. If you go down behind the rock, there is a creek." "I know. I will wait at the creek with Sergeant Kim. See if you can coax Private Choi and bring him there. We can't let anyone else know about this. Around 8 o'clock, okay?" "Sure." The night air was frosty as we waited for Sergeant Lee to bring Private Choi. At the beginning of the hilltop operation, a full moon had filled the sky, but now a half moon was shining down. I heard a faint cricket chirping from somewhere. Despite weeks of heavy artillery fire that had razed the entire landscape, I couldn't fathom how a cricket had survived the intense burning and was now chirping on the October night. Back in our Seoul house, crickets used to chirp in the fall. Thoughts of my parents and brother, their bodies burned in the ashes, choked me up. It had been 2 years since that day, but it seemed like it was just yesterday. I heard footsteps, followed by Sergeant Lee's voice, "Private Choi, you fought hard. Well done. I've hidden some liquor behind a rock. Before the battle resumes, let's share a bottle of soju for reconciliation, shall we?" He spoke loudly to let me know he was there. I had heard that Private Choi had a liking for liquor. The way Sergeant Lee brought up soju on the battleground made me crack a smile, even in those tense moments. Sergeant Kim stealthily approached from behind. Private Choi stuffed a towel into his mouth. Private turned his face back, surprised. Sergeant Lee kicked his leg. As he crumpled, I stepped forward. Under the moonlight, Private Choi recognized me and flinched. "Son of a bitch," I muttered. My low voice sounded grim even to my ears. In the dim light, a look of terror flashed across his face. "You dared to point a rifle at the lieutenant?" Sergeant Lee spat. He tied the private to a tree with the rope he had brought and then aimed his gun at him. "I will handle this," I said, aiming my weapon at him. Private Choi's heavy body struggled, and the tree shook. "Stay still." Sergeant Lee hit Choi's head with the butt of his rifle. One shot rang out under the moonlight, and then blood pumped from his body, flowing over the ash by the creek. He and I were the same age. Why did I have to do that? Dark thoughts briefly clouded my mind, but we had to deal with the body and return to our position as soon as possible. That night, around 1 o'clock, the hilltop was right in front of us. However, Due to the enemy's machine gun fire from there, we couldn't approach. One of my colleagues, Lieutenant Kong, and his 2 soldiers advanced toward the hilltop with their hand grenade pins off and blew up the machine gun nest. The trio was killed on the spot, and Hilltop 395 was retaken. Private Choi was counted among the day's casualties. Sergeant Lee came to me the next day and discreetly informed me, "Lieutenant, his hometown is Cheorwon. The notification will be delivered to his mother there." "Thank you, Sergeant." The following day, while our troops changed positions, the enemy launched another attack, resulting in more casualties. In this battle, Sergeant Kim was killed. He was the one who had come stealthily behind Private Choi and stuffed his mouth with a towel. He had always trusted me as his platoon leader. Upon hearing this report, Sergeant Lee and I paid a silent tribute. Now, the incident was a secret that only Sergeant Lee and I shared. We knew that in wartime, if there were good enough reasons, an officer could kill his subordinate, but I was fearful of his bereaved family. Why was I so afraid of them? Was it because I didn't have any family? I had no one to help me when I was in need. Sergeant Lee, who was with me until the end, suffered piercing bullet wounds in his leg on the last day of the battle. He was transferred to an evacuation hospital. During the 10 days of battle, the hill changed hands 24 times after repeated attacks and counterattacks. It was one of the most intense, position-grasping battles for a small hill during the Korean War. Afterward, the ash-covered, bald mountain looked like an aged white horse lying down. From then on, it was known as Bangma-goji. Bangma means a white horse, and Goji means a hilltop, the White Horse Hilltop. The fighting ended on July 27, 1953, when the armistice was signed. I was 22 years old. Except for the 6 months in the infantry school, I had fought the entire time at the front. Thanks to my ancestors watching over me, I survived and could hold their annual memorial services for my parents and grandparents. According to Korean customs, the eldest son performed an annual memorial service called Jesa, on the day they passed away. Growing up in Seoul, I used to go to my parents' hometown during school vacations. My grandparents lived near Busan, a southern port city of the Korean peninsula, where the Nakdong River met the sea. My grandparents, who had been shocked by the tragic news from Seoul, had passed away while I was fighting on the front. After my discharge from the army, I often went to the wetland near my grandparents' old home, which I used to visit as a child. I comforted myself, watching reeds sway in the winds from the sea, herons dancing in groups, and migratory birds flying high in the sky. I was truly alone. At 33, I had just passed the Class 3 civil servant exam. I was seeing someone and dreaming of a stable family life. On a hot summer day, I dropped by the Westgate Market to buy a cool straw hat. While I was browsing the market, I noticed a man tending a street stall who looked somewhat familiar. His face was sunburnt and his clothes were dirty, but I couldn't quite place him. However, he recognized me immediately and called out, "My lieutenant." At that moment, I heard Private Choi's moans and saw his mouth stuffed with the towel, his face filled with terror. Sergeant Lee looked me up and down and said, "Lieutenant, you seem to be doing well." Although I felt uneasy inside, I pretended to be happy to see him. Embracing the smaller framed man, I said, "Oh, Sergeant Lee, it's been such a long time. Let's have a drink." I exaggerated my delight while concealing my true feelings. We entered a nearby makgeolli house. After emptying several cups of makgeolli, a milky white rice wine known as a farmer's drink, he asked me, "Lieutenant, where do you work?" Since he was 3 years older than I was, I answered his question politely using honorific language and added, "You don't have to call me lieutenant anymore. We are not in the army. You still call me sergeant." "How should I call you, then?" He slurred his words as he got drunk. "I am a street vendor. When it rains, I have to close the stall. When a police officer comes, I have to clear away and run. I don't have the down payment to rent a store. To maintain my grade 3 government job, I had to keep a clean record and couldn't be associated with a shady past. Furthermore, many of my peers were eyeing my position. To keep him quiet, I had to dip into my savings and provide Sergeant Lee with the money for the down payment on his store rental. At that time, I was dating my future wife and saving as much money as possible for our wedding. Since she came from an affluent family, I had to take her to expensive restaurants and nice places on weekends. Her parents initially disapproved of our relationship, mainly because of the age difference and my lack of close relatives, but they eventually allowed us to get married when she became pregnant during her 3rd year of medical school in Daegu. At first, she was too busy with our baby and her studies to pay attention to our finances. However, by the time she completed her residency, she began to show an interest in our bank accounts. One day, she brought up our savings account and questioned certain withdrawals. "What are these for?" "It's not just a few times, but pretty regular withdrawals." So, I had to confess what had happened on that October night when a single cricket chirped faintly, having survived weeks of artillery fire. When I think of it now, the problem was that I was promoted to a desirable position too early in my career and oversaw the construction of buildings under the jurisdiction of the Daegu municipal government. Local builders would not leave me alone. I tried to avoid their bribery as much as I could, but I was trapped sometimes. Sergeant Lee came to me whenever he needed money, knowing that. When I was 46, I became involved in a hotel construction bribery case, and my face was plastered across the front page of the local papers. I was dismissed from a career that had been thriving until then. Following that, I couldn't return to a government job, even though it was the only line of work I was familiar with. I lacked the confidence to start anew as an individual proprietor. I had witnessed too many horrible things when I was a young man. And then, at the pinnacle of my career, I was disgraced by an incident that turned my name into a newspaper headline. That's how my life as a recluse began. One day, Sergeant Lee invited me to the Makjiali house we used to frequent. We were drinking and enjoying slices of blood sausage. He stammered, "Lieutenant, I cannot deny that I was partially responsible for some of your problems. Let me buy you some Makjiali to ease your troubles." I slurred. We were in the same predicament the moment that guy fell by the creekside. "Bring more Makjiali." We had never discussed Private Choi before, but on that day, we drank ourselves into a stupor while talking about him. One positive aspect of being unemployed was that I got free of Sergeant Lee. Now his underwear store was thriving. He was well dressed, and his complexion was glowing, while I had lost some of my tall stature, and my face appeared weathered. With too much time on my hands, my mind was plagued by too many idle thoughts. The memory of that terrified face and the body doubled over under the moonlight haunted me. I had killed him with my own hands, and I couldn't erase his image from my mind. Thoughts like, was I mistaken? Or did he really aim at me? Troubled me. Time had passed, but I was still burdened by the guilt of what I had done in my youth. When I mentioned that I was going to Cheorwon, my wife probably assumed I would head straight to White Horse Hill. However, the first place I wanted to visit was Private Choi's village. According to my research, his mother still lived in a village called Munimi in Cheorwon County. From the train station in Seoul, I took a bus to Cheorwon and then hired a taxi to reach Munimi village. Munimi means, across the water, in Old Korean. Around 4 p.m., I spotted a village of about 40 houses across the river, nestled at the base of a mountain. In front of the village, golden ears of rice swayed in October winds. The Cheorwon Plain had long been a major granary for the nation, and the rice from this area was renowned as clean rice due to its lower pollution levels. This was attributed to its proximity to the natural environment of the demilitarized zone, which had remained untouched by human activity for many decades. After crossing the bridge over the river, the taxi proceeded down a lane flanked by rice fields. I noticed a man in a worn-out sweater walking along the lane with his back to me. I got out of the taxi and approached him. His bronze face was deeply lined, and his skin resembled leather from years of sun exposure. Still, he could be younger than I was. "Would you mind if I asked you a question? Do you know where Mrs. Choi lives? She is in her 90s. You can follow me." He and I walked side by side while my taxi followed us. "I apologize for bothering you like this." "That's fine. Do you see the tin roof house over there? That's her house. She is 96, but her mind is still sharp. She can prepare her meals. Her oldest son was killed in the Battle of White Horse Hill. Her younger son visits occasionally. May I ask why you're coming to see her?" I knew her oldest son. I've been planning to visit his mother for a long time. Is that so? Her oldest son and I grew up together in this village. He was a big, burly guy, like a bear, but he was crafty and full of tricks. I thought he would survive no matter what situation he encountered in the war. But you live and learn. What does she live on? She receives the military death benefit. Her oldest son took on the responsibility after his death. It might sound strange to you, but if he were alive, he might not have been as punctual with the monthly payments. It sure sounded strange to me. Did he mean Private Choi had not been a good son? That if he had lived, he wouldn't have dutifully provided for his mother? He also said Private Choi had been crafty and full of tricks. Didn't they get along well while they were growing up? He led me to the corrugated metal gate of a small, tin-roofed house. This is her place. Through the open gate, I saw an old, withered woman leaning on a cane, gazing up at the mountain. Her arms resembled dead tree branches, gray and wrinkled. I could tell she was once a big person, much like Private Choi. Turning her wrinkled face toward me, she grumbled in a frail voice, "Are you here to see me?" "Yes, your son and I were in the same troop during our time in the army." "You mean you served with my son?" Leaning on her cane, she walked to the flat bamboo bench in the middle of the yard. "Phew," she sighed, taking a seat on the bench. She let out another sigh while massaging her hip. "Come and sit here." I sat on the other corner of the square, flat bench. "Were you near my son when he was shot?" she asked. I barely nodded. "Did he go comfortably?" she inquired. I remained silent. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Why did I even ask that? How could he have gone comfortably when he was shot? I've had this giant boulder pressing on my chest all my life. Her words reminded me of that white boulder that I had told Sergeant Lee to bring Private Choi to so long ago, and how we had taken him to the creek below it. How we tied him on a tree. One shot under the moonlight, and then blood pumping out of his body flowing over the ash at the side of the creek. I felt my chest tighten, and it became difficult to breathe. If my mother hadn't been killed by the bombing in Seoul and was still alive, she would be about this woman's age. I finally broached the subject I had come here to discuss. "I don't know how you'll feel about this, but I brought some money for you. Winter is coming, and I know how harsh it can be around here. I spent a few winters in this area, so I understand. I've prepared 50 million won for you, some in cash and some in checks. Please use it for the winter and stay warm." I handed a bulging envelope to her emaciated hand. "Why would I get money from you?" she asked. "I was indebted to your son." "That must be a lifetime ago." "Yes, indeed. I received my son's killed in action notice from the government when I was 41. That drained the hope and energy out of me. When I lost my husband 2 years earlier, it wasn't like that. When your child is dead, you get to learn what hopelessness is. When my son was killed and buried, I thought I wouldn't be able to eat or sleep. But I still ate and slept. It was disgusting. Listening to her, I was sweating nervously. I imagined that at any moment the old woman might attack me like a mad dog, foaming at the mouth and screaming, "Screw you. You are going to offer me that trivial amount of money for peace of mind? Go away." I needed to make an excuse to leave. I barely said, "So long, I have to leave now." "Already?" she said, looking up at me with an expression on her face that seemed to ask, "Don't you have something to confess?" I fled through the gate and got into the waiting taxi. The sun was setting in the west beyond the October fields. "Shall I take you to Cheorwon Hotel?" the driver asked. "Yes," I replied, resting my head against the back seat. The next morning, the same driver came to the hotel to take me to where we could see the now famous White Horse Hill. I joined other people who had registered for the tour of the battlefield viewing area. A convoy of army trucks escorted our cars. We passed a train station with a burned skeleton of a train, which used to run between Seoul, Cheorwon, and Wonsan, an East Coast harbor that now belonged to North Korea. Before the division of Korea, the train was used to transport to Seoul agricultural products from Cheorwon and seafood from the harbor. At last, we arrived at the parking lot of the towering White Horse Hill War Memorial. I got out of the taxi and walked up the slope to the highest point of the memorial site. Finally, I saw White Horse Hill across the Cheorwon Plain. I had to return here and see this at least once in my life. I remembered how the hilltop 395 had been scorched with knee-high soot and ash after weeks of bombardments. The shape of the hilltop had changed, and its height had been lowered by 1 meter, resembling an aging white horse lying down. Now, the hill was thickly forested again. Where was the spot that we had lured Private Choi to that night? That had been before we had recaptured the hilltop. Perhaps the spot was about 2/3 of the way up. A flock of wild geese flew above the plain. Cheorwon Plain is a paradise for migratory birds, a place of respite as they make their travels up and down the globe. Cheorwon County's northern boundary is a part of the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, a strip of land between the northern limit line and the southern limit line. It's approximately 4 kilometers or 2.5 miles wide, running across the midsection of the Korean peninsula. The DMZ was established at the end of the Korean War to serve as a buffer zone between North and South Korea. Contrary to its name, this area is the most heavily militarized border in the world, with landmines everywhere. On the return trip to town, we passed the cement frame of the old Communists' Labor Party headquarters, an ugly, abandoned structure. How many young people were tortured and killed there? It was a time of immense struggle for the young men of this country. It was also a time of tragedy for people on the peninsula. Over 10% of the Korean population had perished during the war, making it one of the deadliest wars in modern history, especially for the civilian population of North Korea. I asked the taxi driver, "Do you know where Dopiansa Temple is?" "Yes, I do. Please take me there. A long time ago, I heard there was a temple in Cheorwon named Dopiansa." I knew little about Buddhism, but I wondered if the Chinese characters for Dopiansa meant to enter a state of enlightenment, leaving behind the troubles of this world. As the taxi neared the temple, the driver said, "Once, this place was within the civilian control zone, so no civilian could come here. But now, the control zone has been pushed farther north, so we can visit the temple now." The fall scenery along the road was breathtaking. After decades of no human activity, nature had taken over, with thriving vegetation and rare species of flora and fauna surviving. On this cloudless October day, it seemed like the perfect place to find peace and happiness, but the grim reality was that numerous landmines were still buried not too far away. I got out of the taxi and entered the deserted temple grounds. The modest temple was built in the 9th century. As the granite pagoda silently greeted me, I turned toward the main sanctum where the national treasure, Vairocana Buddha, was kept. I was accustomed to seeing glittery golden Buddha statues in a temple hall, but I found this unassuming iron statue to my liking. The oval face had a benevolent smile and a unique hand gesture, with one hand holding the thumb of the other, raising it to its chest. The simplicity gave me a sense of peace and harmony. I took off my shoes and entered the hall, thinking of the 108 torments of humanity that the Buddhists talked about. At 76, I wanted to be free of the torments of my youth. I made an offering and bowed to the Iron Buddha. I kept on bowing, kneeling to the floor for my sole and private choice, as well as Sergeant Lee's.